One of the things that I find from audiences who ask me questions about population is that they have no faith in the way the world works. First of all, they don't know how the world works, but they don't have the same faith that I have in the way that it works. The living community on this planet works and has worked for something like 3 billion years. The principle, that one of the fundamental principle by which it works is really astonishingly simple. Populations balance each other because they are balances of food and feeders. To be very simple about it, when a given population in a given community grows a little large, it eats up its food supply, which means that its food diminishes, which means that it then diminishes. It goes down, the feeder population goes down, and as the feeder population goes down, its food population comes back up. And as its population comes back up, the feeder population comes up as well. And as the feeder population comes up, the food population goes down again. And so you have a perpetual balancing of populations. As one goes up, the other goes down. As it goes down, the other one follows it down, and then the other comes up, and this one follows it up, and so on. And everything stays in balance this way. And the reason that I drag God into this statement is, in part, that because the system is self-regulating, it isn't necessary for God to leap in and say, "Oh my God, this population over here is going down. I've got to send in more food." It is not necessary to do that because the system is self-regulating. When I wrote Ishmael, I knew this. I knew that this is because I'd studied a little bit of ecology, and this is practically the ABCs of ecology. And so I knew that this was how it worked. And I thought it would be quite easy to make this point in Ishmael, and never guessed how very inflammatory this would prove to be and how difficult it would be. Far and away, the most inflammatory topic in any of my books is this one. And it is partly because there is no, or very little, or very rarely, understanding of how the system works, and that it does work infallibly. It always works. It has always worked. It has worked for 3 billion years. In the case of the human population, our particular cultural group, has found a way to defeat the negative feedback system that was in place on this planet, so that instead of the human population, when it gets too big, its food supply begins to dwindle, we simply grow more, which means that our population can grow more. And instead of saying, "Oh, well, we now have to diminish, have to go down because our food population has diminished," we say, "Oh no, we'll just grow more food." And so we just go more food, more people, more food, more people, more food, more people, more food, more people, indefinitely. which is how we got to this point that we are at right now. People have no faith, or very little faith. The people who have difficulty with this concept have no faith in the idea that if we did not continue to chase population with food production, that there would not be massive famine. They're sure that if we ever said, okay, we're not going to continue this race anymore between food and population. Instead, we're going to drop out of this race. We're not going to continue this race anymore. For some reason, people imagine that this would spell catastrophe for the human race. They know it doesn't spell catastrophe for any other species. Every other species is controlled by its food supply, and it isn't a catastrophe for them. But people are convinced, many people are convinced, that it does spell catastrophe for us. Alan, this is Dr. Alan Thornhill, professor of evolutionary biology at Rice University.
My area of specialty is conservation biology. I teach ecology and I teach evolutionary biology, but what I'm most interested in is the application of ecological and biological principles to the preservation of biodiversity. For me, over the years, the entire field has been boiled down to one issue. We are constantly, and as Dan has so eloquently put it, turning the biomass of the planet into human mass. As the biomass of the planet, which is the diversity of life on Earth, gets converted into human mass, we have more people, but we have less eagles, less grass, less snails, less octopi, less everything else. Because as we consume land, resources, habitat, fresh water, fresh air, for our own use, it absolutely must preclude everyone else from getting access to those resources. It must limit their access because we are restricting access for our use only. And the bigger bite that we take out of the dinner plate that is the world, the less there is for every other critter and plant on the planet to eat from. Turning human mass into larger human mass is always at the expense of the rest of the biomass on the planet. And so as a conservation biologist, my mission is clear. The application of ecological principles to the protection of biodiversity is helping people to understand that as we consume more and as we add more people to the planet, we are limiting, reducing, driving to extinction the biodiversity of the planet. And while we may ask ourselves, well, what's the point? Why do we need 100,000 species of snail? That's not really the issue here. It's not what we need as in numbers of species. What we need is the entire biosphere which supports life. Because if it doesn't function properly to support life, it doesn't function properly to support us. And what we are literally doing is taking the bricks out of the building beneath us. And ultimately, the building will be unstable. So how many of those bricks need to stay in place? We can't answer that question. And some of the bricks are bigger than others. But a little brick could be a keystone brick for an archway over a door. And if you lose that, no, the building may not completely collapse, but the beauty, the aesthetics, the functionality, various different characteristics of that building may disappear. And there may have been value in that particular characteristic.
And it isn't reclaimable. We can't go back and say, oh, gee, we didn't want that to happen. So we will go back and put that keystone back in place, because the species are gone, and there's no way to get them back. I'm afraid there are people in the world who do imagine that it would be possible for us to have a world in which there were humans and rice.
Extinction, of course, is when a species that we recognize as a unique species goes completely, well, extinct, gone from the face of the earth. It does not have any representatives extant on the planet. That certainly is a natural process. There have been lots of species that have gone extinct well before humans ever started growing food. Well before humans were even on the planet, there were lots of extinctions. Indeed, lots of our ancestors have gone extinct, and we don't see, versions of earlier humans around either. But the rate of natural extinction as species are unable to adapt to changing environments, for example, and they just cease to reproduce and slowly go senescent and die out. The rate of that actually occurring is quite small, quite slow. We're talking evolutionary time here. Things don't go extinct very rapidly because they don't evolve very rapidly. And if things were going extinct more rapidly than they were evolving, well, there wouldn't be any life on the planet. So the natural extinction rate is really quite slow. The actual numbers of species going extinct per day or per year or per decade, whatever, at the current time is a very difficult number to pin down. Mostly because we don't know how many species are on the planet to begin with. And so to say, when we lose X habitat, we've lost so many species. Well, we can identify the ones that we know that we've lost, the ones that have names, the ones that we've identified. If they used to be there and they're no longer there, we know they're extinct. But we don't know what else was there. There's work done in the tropics on an ongoing basis where they will gas a canopy of a particular species, one individual species of tree, and they'll find hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of species of beetle, of invertebrates besides beetles. Beetles are the most common. Thousands of species that have never been seen, never been identified. They don't have names. We don't even know what family to put them in because it's a completely new organization of life that we've never even seen before. So the point of all that is it's difficult to pin that number down. However, based on what we do know, just based on the species that we do know exist, there's some debate about it, but it's fairly agreed upon that somewhere on the order of 1 to 2 orders of magnitude above the natural extinction rate is what humans are driving things out of existence. And an order of magnitude, of course, is multiple of 10. So 100 times the natural extinction rate is not unheard of in the view of some scientists. So we are driving things to extinction at 100 times the natural rate that would be happening in the background whether we were doing anything or not. Well, unless things are evolving at an equal pace, we are most definitely depleting the planet of biodiversity. We are whittling away at the capital of the planet. We're not chewing on the interest, we are chewing on the capital, and that's a problem.
So this process, does it boil down to lowering a birth rate throughout the world? Or am I missing another method of reducing population increase?
We have a systemic thrust toward overpopulation. The thrust in our culture is unique, as our culture is unique. We are the only culture that I know of in the history of the world. We are the only species in the world that has ever made of food a commodity. That is, you can, by growing food, make money, get rich. And because we have tied the amount we buy our food by the pound. So the more food you make, the more money you make. This means, well, our farmers, the farmers in Iowa, Nebraska, and so on, they're not growing food because they think people are hungry. They're not growing food because they want to see more humans on the earth. They're growing food because it's money. And the more they grow, the more money they're going to make. So we have a system that is constantly and forever, day in and day out, driving up food production. Of course, we need that increased production all the time because our population is growing as well. The traditional way of seeing this is to wonder if we're going to have enough food to feed our growing population, which is a paradox to me, because the problem is, when are we going to stop increasing our population by continuing to increase food production? That's what we're doing, is we're driving up food production, we are driving up the population itself. So it's kind of a strange way of looking at it, to think that we're trying to catch up to population all the time. We are driving population up all the time. So it isn't that we're trying to catch it, it's that we're constantly pushing it up through food production. Now, when it comes to doing something about food production, we have to think in terms of another systemic change. We can't ever think of restricting. That was what I was shaking my head. That was the word restricting. We can't ever think of having some global police force that is going to go around and checking people's barns and to seeing how much hay they have and how much they're growing in their fields. That's never going to happen. We have to make a systemic change, and I suspect that, or I can suggest that one systemic change that is possible is to stop buying food by quantity. This isn't something that we would do at retail level, but many people don't make their living by producing things in quantity. Lawyers don't get paid by the word, for example. An obstetrician doesn't get paid by the pound of the baby that he or she delivers. And there's no reason, there's no need for farmers to be paid by quantity either. What they want is to make a living, of course. But they don't have to be, because we don't have to give them that incentive to say, if you want to make more money this year than you made, then you have to grow more food. That's the system they're operating on right now. But we don't have to do that. We don't have to do that. There's no necessity to do that. There's no law in the universe that says we have to do that. There is no other species that has the food under lock and key. In the rest of the world, all food is free. And among lever peoples everywhere, food is free. You go and get it, and no one can stop you.
And if you want your population to grow, you've got to work harder.
Yes.
You've got to collect more food. You don't work harder to buy more, you go out and you collect more. But then you're up against the resistance of everybody else that's got their idea about collecting their food. I may be dragging too much into the discussion right now.
The way that it worked in the world before we came along with our better way, sorry, it's fairly. I think it's going out.
Stable.
Who is we when we came with our better way?
Humanity. Yeah, I've got to be careful about that.
Humanity since a certain time?
Our culture began about 10,000 years ago in the Near East. That's when people began to live by growing food exclusively. Before that, they had grown food, But they finally said, okay, we're just going to be farmers now. We're going to live entirely by growing our own food. We're not the only people in the world who did that. But, for example, the Maya did that also. The Aztecs did that also. The Olmec did that also. The Olmec quit. The Maya quit. The Hohokam did it. They quit. And I speculate that this is because they ultimately got to a point where they didn't like what they were doing. If you look at what we found when we arrived in North America, we found tribal groups or nations with fairly impenetrable borders. But one thing that was certain was that in each of these groups, you lived with your own food resources. So if you were the, let's say, the Navajo here, and let's say the Ute here, if your population density doubled, you could not go to the Utes and say, oh, our population has doubled, can we get some food from you? No, because they were living at the limits of their own food as well. They're not going to give you any food. You had to stay where you were and manage your own resources. It was true throughout these groups. So in effect, you had an impenetrable border around the resources. And the remarkable thing about this is that it worked. As I keep stressing in Ishmael and all my books, though not very specifically or not maybe explicitly, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. The wheel came to us. We know how the wheel works. All we have to do is look at it and say, oh my goodness, humans lived in a way that worked once upon a time. Now, I'm not saying that we can necessarily go back and live in this particular model, but we must learn from the way that worked. Instead of saying, oh, how can we find a way? There's never been a way that worked for humans. It is untrue. This way worked. And it would work today if, for example, this were Houston, and this were a border out here, and that the people in Houston, by agreement, said, okay, we're going to live within these resources here, and we're not going to go over to Iowa and say, send us food from Iowa. We're not going to go to Hawaii and say, send us food from Hawaii. We're going to live within the resources of this area here, whatever would sustain this population. If I don't know how this border would have to go out, maybe 100 miles or something. I have no idea how big a border would have to be. But if it was understood and agreed, okay, the folks in this area, that's it. You're going to have to live with these resources. You can't go out and get other people's resources anymore. You're going to have to live with your resources. Well, now the people in that area would have to find ways to live within those resources. I know this is of course slightly a joke, but it's perfectly true all the same. That if we say, okay, let's breed for smallness. Let's all start producing children who, as adults, get to be that big. You can have many more people. I mean, literally, that's true, because they would eat less. They would take less of the resources. Now we're going to do that. But one way or another, let's say that this is what is the population of Houston?
County's about 3.3 million.
3.3 million. Okay, so we say, okay, we're going to have to keep this at 3.3 million because we're not going to be able to get any more food out here. We've made that agreement because we would like to have a future for our children. We'd like to see that they have a world to live in 50 years or 100 years or 1,000 years. Can you imagine that? Why shouldn't humans live for another 1,000 years? We lived for 3 million. Why should we die at the end of the next century? You should live here for millions of years. If we're going to have that happen, we are going to have to get our population under control. So we're going to say, all right, we're going to be 3.3 million. And because there is no one right way for people to live, we're going to make our choices in here. And however people in this area want to do it, that's where we're going to do it.
A population is stable if its birth rate and its death rate are equal. And so right now the human population's birth rate is greater than its death rate. And so our population is increasing. And so if, as you suggest, we stabilize the production of food, you say that this will bring, our population birth and death rate into balance, and we'll have a stable population. So the question is, did that happen through a decrease in the birth rate, or an increase in the death rate, or some combination of the two?
I would say, personally, I don't know. Personally, I don't care. It may be that I'm looking at the thing at a too simple a level. Let me show you how I see it. In a given place, you have a species. That's one species. That's a feeder species, and their food is this red thing here. And when this species starts going up like this, then this species is going to start going down. And as this goes down, this goes down. And as this goes down, then this starts coming back up, and so on. So they're always doing this dance here of up and down. And probably it is true that if you look at these areas right here, that births and deaths are equal. That may be true. I don't particularly care, so long as what you have is this result with feeder populations and food populations balancing themselves out.
Well, if your population is going down, your death rate has to be higher than your birth rate.
Yeah, I guess so.
That involves a certain amount of pain that I just want to know how you accept that.
How do you accept increasing the number of people that are in pain every year by increasing the food?
This is not a graph about death. It's not a graph of starvation. This is a graph of numbers. Now, when the food goes down, it isn't that famine sets in here. It isn't, no.
Okay.
Because, see, this is what is happening with every species on the planet, without exception, is that they are always in constant flux and always balancing each other out. There are many other factors involved besides hunger.
Okay.
When a species, this species here, when its food is dropping here, the members, the individual members, don't have as much time for mating as they did when there was plenty of food. They have to spend more time hunting for food as they have less time to mate. The females of the species will not tend to carry young to term as much as when there was plenty of food. They will tend not to have their offspring live through the first year as much as when there was plenty of food. They will tend not to have the time to take as good care of their young. So there are many, many different factors involved in that. Alan, what do you think of what I just said?
I wouldn't necessarily improve on it, but I might add a few other biological mechanisms, because I think that's what people get stuck on. Well, what is the mechanism for decreasing population growth rates?
No, that's population. That's not population growth rates. He drew
Well,
the population decreasing.
the slope of the line indicates the growth rate. So whether it's a steep slope or it's just increasing is not really an issue. What we'd like to do is get it to where it's flat.
I'm sorry, I need axes then. You've got time along the x-axis. Is
Time
your
on the
line
bottom,
population?
size on the vertical
It is,
axis.
okay, so your population is decreasing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, your population size will track your food.
Thank you.
And you'll see that with every species on the planet, because there isn't anything else that it could do but track its food.
We're with you on that one.
Okay.
May I interject? It's kind of a question, but also not. Actually, these variations are probably so slight in a healthy case that we're really looking at two parallel lines. It's only when we get very close that we see those fluctuations. So I don't see it's like, thousands of people eating and then thousands of people dying. It's a slight variation, so that viewed a little further away, it probably looks like two parallel lines, I would imagine. Would that make sense?
That would be the case under some circumstances, but in other circumstances, there's textbook examples of rabbits, snowshoe hares, and lynxes, where the populations fluctuate wildly every year as the populations go through cycles. But there are other populations where it's not nearly as dramatic, and you wouldn't necessarily, in this idea of slowing human population growth rates down to zero population growth rate, and then maybe even eventually decreasing the total human population growth rate. We're not talking about suddenly lopping off 40% of the food production on the planet. Yeah, you'd have massive starvation and hunger and misery throughout the planet, and probably wars would break out, and then nothing that you intended would ever come to pass. The mechanism that we want to have operate are all the normal biological mechanisms that regulate every other population, not the dramatic, catastrophic mechanisms, but the normal biological mechanisms, which means you just stop increasing food production and you will not continue to increase the growth rate. Our growth rate is increasing on average. We have exponential growth, which means every year, instead of 3 people being added every second, this year, it'll be 4 people being added every second 2 years from now, which means we've got to stop the increase before we can even begin to discuss the idea of, well, maybe everybody would have a higher standard of living if there were only 2.5 billion people on the planet instead of 6.2 billion people on the planet. So one of the things that people get hung up on is, well, what are the mechanisms? Are people just going to stop reproducing because they decide it's a better thing for the planet? Well, no. That's not going to happen. Species don't do that. They are after their own personal gain and their own personal reproduction and fulfilling their biological desire to procreate and reproduce and carry on their genes. And we're no different. And if we think that we're going to be so much different and that we're going to be able to state and abide by this new rule that says 1 child for every family, we're fooling ourselves. We are deluding ourselves as much as we're deluding ourselves into believing we can become godlike on earth because we are sinners. And that's the way it goes. We can't change that. We're not perfect. And we can't make rules that everybody's going to follow. It won't happen. The only way it's going to work is to allow the biological mechanisms which work on the rest of the planet and have always worked, let them act. And what they are things like Dan was saying. If you spend more time collecting food and spend more time making food, and I don't mean making food like growing food, I mean buy all your food raw and have to make your own meals from scratch and not buy them in shrink wrap packages or, microwavable dinners, you're not going to have as much time to do a lot of the other things that you'd be doing, which would be supporting your children. You're going to be spending time surviving. And one of the things that we've gotten away from in U.S. and other advanced societies, or whatever we'd like to call them, is this idea of, well, decrease the total amount of time you spend producing meals for yourself, and you have all this other time to do everything else. Well, that's fine, but it also means that there's a tremendous amount of resources that have to go into producing those foods to do that. And we can draw some graphs to show how that actually influences this total rate of biomass destruction. Even if we were to stop human population expansion now, if everyone continued to advance towards the way we do business, we being, United States, Western Europe, etc., we would continue to have this problem far into the future. So there's other issues that we have to deal with, which we can come back to. But the point here is time, natural biological mechanisms, under food stress, under time stress, reproduction is going to decrease.
Yeah, this is one reason why I don't consider myself an environmentalist, because the very concept of, at the base of environmentalism, is a picture of the world as a place where humans live, and then there is humanity's environment. So it's us and it. This is a false and horrible picture of the world, a very antique picture of the world. And I know that if the world is saved and there is another paradigm around the corner, which there must be or we're not going to be saved, one of the things that will be lost is this idea, this very antique, very old-fashioned idea of humans and environment. That is not our environment out there, folks. Those are our neighbors in the community of life. And we must listen to them and we must respect them, and because they are keeping us alive.
Joseph Collins mentions that he talks about not only India and some Central American countries, but also the Philippines, and the reasons why people are in the situation where they have to have children, or they feel they have to have children to have some hope, and also to work the land. They need the children for that purpose.
This is the position generally of the Union of Concerned Scientists in their warning to humanity. They identify the population problem as basically being economic and social. And so they have encouraged people to think that all we have to do to end our population expansion is to end economic and social injustice all over the world. Simple, right? Shouldn't take more than a few months to do that. This is, in my view, a will-o'-the-wisp because these things are things that people have been striving to do for thousands of years without ever doing them. And why we think that this will be something that is doable in the next few years is quite bizarre to me. And they don't recognize any of the biological realities involved. This is typical of what I call the atomistic approach to problems as opposed to the systemic approach, which is that our population problem will be solved, or if our population problem isn't solved, it's your fault and 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 your fault 6 billion times. And if population goes up as it every day, they can just shrug and say, well, see, it's just the people are not doing what they should do. And it's just people are no good. And this kind of thinking is what must change. And we must begin to see that we are a biological population just like every other biological population on this planet, and begin to think of our expansion in those terms, and begin to come to grip with it in those terms, and realize that our difficulty is systemic and our solution must be systemic. And we can't just go around and saying it's your fault, your fault, your fault, your fault, your fault, your fault 6 billion times and hope to make something happen. Alan?
I'd like to actually address directly your concerns where some researchers have speculated that it is because of socioeconomic settings that drives population growth. This is a pretty common understanding of the issues, but it completely ignores at least 2 levels that come before social interactions. Social interactions are laid on top of at least 2 other levels. And yes, social interactions could affect population growth, but not until you recognize and start to deal with the 2 levels below it. The two levels below it, I just happened to give a lecture on this today at school where we were talking about social organisms and what does social structure do to a population. How does it modify the way they use their environment and the way they interact with the world around them? The first way, it's the third thing, the first way that organisms interact with their environment is with abiotic factors, the weather, the water, the wind, the light, the resources available. So you'll find larger populations where there are more resources. That makes sense. Second thing is, populations are regulated by their interactions with other biological organisms. If you have competitors that are after the same resources you are, you will be limited by your interaction with them because they're going to want some of the same resources you've got. If you have predators that are preying on you, you're going to spend time running, so you're not going to be able to eat and procreate all the time. If you are a prey, or if you are a predator and you're hunting for prey, you're going to spend time running because you've got to catch your prey items. You're going to be subject to disease. You're going to be subject to parasites. You're going to be subject to all these other things that interactions with biological organisms does to you. And so that's going to also limit your population and change the way you interact with your environment. Once those 2 levels are accounted for, then yes, the social structure will lay across the top of all that and in addition affect the way you interact with your environment. But I'll guarantee you that the populations in India and the populations in Central American countries did not grow without more food. They can't possibly. You cannot make more biomass from thin air. There has to be food. You have to consume calories to make more muscle. It's a biological law. There's no way to get around that one. You can't eat rocks, you can't eat dirt and grow humans. So in India, there may have been social events that were driving people to grow more food or to import more food, but it had to be there or the populations wouldn't have grown. I don't even have to know the circumstances of the population growth to know that if there was population growth, there was more food, because there isn't any other reality.
But there did come, I've heard this many times, that there is a notion abroad, and I'm not sure where it came from, that when food disappears, the population goes up. And this is completely unbiological, as we're talking miracles here. This is not biology. Where there are more people, there must be more food, because you can't make people out of anything but food. You might get pregnant, but you can't make people out of nothing. You cannot make people out of nothing. Getting pregnant and making people is different.
Don't we run a part of what I'm seeing in this is the notion that, and let's, instead of looking at Houston and Iowa, let's look at the United States and, say, Africa, where there is a lot of famine, and we traditionally do our best to send a great deal of food over there to help. If I'm following what you're saying here tonight, it would seem to me that what we are doing is not so much helping those people as setting them up for a bigger and worse famine down the road, because their population will increase. Now, if that's the case, we're going to run into some political reactions here, because some people, if we were to withhold the food, number one, it kind of goes against our religious traditions in this country. Second thing is, if we withhold the food, it can also be viewed as a kind of a way of eliminating a certain group of people as opposed to other kinds of people, and that creates all kinds of reactions that are difficult. How do we, is this an educational problem, or how do we go about overcoming those resistances?
We wish we had the easy answer.
Boy, do we have. Now we're getting into it. I found after a while that I have to step back and talk about how the situation got to be the way it is in North Africa, or in Africa in general. I hope this won't shake everybody's value structures to their foundations, but the people of our culture are very interested in expanding economic marketplaces. We like to create more customers for our goods. It has been something that we have been doing in undeveloped nations for probably 200 years or more, is helping them increase their population. It's called Coca-Cola colonialism. We want to see those markets expand because we want to go in and sell them things. So the lofty things that we've done in Africa with the Peace Corps and so on are not quite as lofty as people would like to see them. Bringing them the benefits of our greater technical wisdom about growing food, showing them how to grow more food, and indeed showing them how to reduce infant mortality and all of these things, all of these wonderful, generous things, has resulted, well, it's North Africa is not a rich land. This is not California we're talking about here. The human population has always been very small, or in any reasonable time span. And the human population has been going along there for hundreds of thousands of years at a very low level. When times get bad, as they are now, if there is a drought, it means going like this. And then, times return to normal and so on. What we did is come in and show them how to build a much bigger population. Isn't that nice? Aren't we wonderful people? And then, when times got bad, of course, that is when they started starving. So let's talk about their carrying capacity. We'll do the carrying capacity in black here. Well, I'll do it in red. So carrying capacity, pretty much follows this, or population follows carrying capacity. When the carrying capacity goes down, population goes down. And so what we did was show them how to increase the carrying capacity. But when the drought hit, the carrying capacity went down here, back to where it used to be. And what you have in here are starving people. So over here is the United States. And we have a carrying capacity that is just tremendous. We have a tremendous carrying capacity. And our population is nowhere near that carrying capacity. So it's possible for us to take some of that carrying capacity and send it over here to maintain these people in their famine, to keep them at this level here, which is what we're doing. They're starving because they have outgrown We've helped them outgrow their own resources. Back here, when they're down here, they were never living in famine because their population was very small. They had been living in balance with their resources for countless generations. Now they are not, and so they're starving. So in our continued benevolence, we feel that we must send them food to keep them at that unrealistic population level. People ask me at this point, well, Mr. Quinn, are you saying that you would let these people starve? And my answer to that is, as this was foretold in Ishmael, that what my answer would be is that I do not let the rain fall. I don't let the hurricane blow. I don't let the earthquakes happen. And I don't let people starve. Because, contrary to what you may believe, I am not God. Sorry if I disillusioned you about that. So the question is, if you were God, what would you do about those people? Well, I sort of gave a hint about that answer a little earlier. What does God do about those people? What was the predator and prey that you were talking about? The horseshoe,
Snowshoe.
Snowshoe
hare and a lynx.
Okay, the snowshoe hare and the lynx. I guess that's the. Doesn't matter which is which. They're always doing that. See. Now, when the snowshoe hares become scarce, then the lynx become hungry. What does God do about that? God does not do anything about that because there's a system there that works for these animals. It is in place. God does not have to rush in and send more hair to the lynx, because God knows that in another few months the hare will come back and the lynx will come back, because that's the way it works. And the same thing is true in North Africa. So your argument, if you have an argument, if you think I'm cruel and disgusting, your argument is really with God and not with me, because that was the system that God came up with. I didn't come up with that system. Now I know that if you leave these people alone, they will be once again back in balance with their resources, and they will be happy people. They will no longer be living in famine. And I say to you, if you ask me, and I say I'll be a mean God for you, because a mean God would love to see them starving. I love to see people starving, and I want to see more people starving. And if I were a mean God, then I would say yes. You should keep those people starving. You should definitely send food over there, because that way more and more people will be starving, and they'll go on starving for longer. I really love to see people starving. But this indeed is a hard saying.
So can I ask this?
Sure.
Sort of from the other side, if the population in North America is so far below its carrying capacity, why isn't it increasing faster?
Because the third level has already kicked in. The social level is already working. Our population was small enough and developed this social structure early enough that it began to have an effect early on. And so it overlays and modifies what happens at the lower two levels.
So after a certain population density is achieved, then
It's not a density issue.
No.
It's just the social organization. Once the social organization is in place, and once the system of community interaction is in place, once there is a relatively stable...
You're going to have to do the demographic trap.
Once there is a basically stable social organization, there isn't... That system really does modify what's going on at the lower levels, but not until it's in place. And as long as you have these wildly fluctuating social structures, you won't get that maintenance of population below its carrying capacity is where I was going with that.
So why then is it a bad policy to try to bring about this social organization in other places?
To send food,
No.
No. I mean, there's plenty of food here, right?
right?
I mean,
So what do you want to
more
do?
food than we could possibly ever eat.
So what do you want to do? You want other places to be just like that?
Well, these places that are so trying to bring about, market reforms and enhancing.
Oh yes. Okay, sorry. Why not try to bring about that third level
Yeah,
to help
yes,
modify? Perfect.
yeah.
Yes, it needs to be there. Absolutely, it has to be there. But if you wait for it to be there, the population is going to be 50 billion people. That's the problem.
Could you comment on China at this point?
It's a great big country on the east.
It's a great big policy that instituted this reform, and in the
I'm
course
sorry,
of a
I'm being flippant.
generation, slowed their population growth tremendously, I believe. I'm not an expert on this at all.
But it's still growing.
And it's the largest in the world.
And it's 1.2 billion or something. And it's still growing. And they still have to make more food every year because they have to keep up with their population. They have instituted some population control measures, but
Have they slowed their growth?
Have they what?
the growth rate is actually slowed, but it's still growing. So it's not growing. There are still more births and more people surviving than there are people dying. And so
There's one point that I wanted to make, that the prediction is not that the more food, the faster the growth. There is not necessarily a correlation there. So the fact that we have more food doesn't mean that we should therefore, or that I predict, that we should therefore be growing faster. That isn't the deal. The food, you see, the food is not.
I thought that was the whole idea.
Yeah, I thought that was the whole point.
No. I didn't talk about speed. I didn't talk about speed of growth.
the rate is independent.
All right.
So
If you've got, you've got Farmer McGregor here. He's got a ton of food on his, but that doesn't mean that the McGregor clan is doubling every 3 weeks. If the McGregor clan may actually not be growing at all. It's the people around him that are growing, because that's where the food is going. Now, one of his neighbors is India. Nowadays, it doesn't matter whether it's India or Ohio. It's all the same to him, the McGregors. So, this food is promoting growth, but it's not promoting growth within the confines of the McGregor farm. It is promoting growth wherever it goes. And now it goes anywhere.
maybe it would be helpful to further explain this idea of carrying capacity and actually talk about why it is the case that while the North Americans are under their carrying capacity, the carrying capacity that we're under isn't necessarily going unused. Okay, there is an issue there.
Right. So we're sending, we're taking some of our carrying capacity and giving that to India.
And this is a really important issue because
we're not denying anybody in North America food and saying, no, that belongs to the Indians.
No, because we could grow more.
Right.
We have the technology to increase production.
So if the McGregors have a lot of food, they won't grow. But how big does a population have to be before these population dynamics kick in?
The social ones?
The social ones?
Well,
Is that what you're saying?
The biological
I'm
ones?
sorry. Just sort of this idea that if there's more food, then there will be more people.
Let me draw a couple diagrams here, and let's see if we answer your question. If we don't, we'll come back to it.
Okay.
We want to look at two issues here. There's two things that go into deciding how many people can live in an area. The total number of resources in that area and the total number of resources that each person in that area consumes, right? So if you had a pie and everybody just ate a nibble, you could support a lot of people on that pie. If you had a pie and everybody ate a third of it, you could only support 3 people. Makes sense, right? So we're talking about total resource use and total population size as two factors that are very tightly together. So if we look at resource use and we look at population size, we would find that small populations can actually support a huge resource use for a given size pie. Right? That makes sense. For a given size pie, a small population could eat a lot of pie each. But a really large population on the same given size pie has to eat less of the pie per person to keep everything working. Or some people get no pie at all, right? Okay. And of course, there's some relationship here that says anywhere along the spectrum, we can predict sort of what level of resource use we can support with a population of a given size if the resources are static. Same number of resources exist for this population size as for this population size. It's just that this population size has to consume fewer resources per unit, per person. Okay. Now what I'm talking about here is the carrying capacity, which is in ecology just called big K, and the carrying capacity is the total number of organisms, beings, whatevers that can be supported in a given area. And in this case, I'm talking about carrying capacity global. There is some number of organisms that can be supported on the planet based on the total number of resources available. And it maxes out when we get to the limits of the total photosynthetic capture that happens from the sun, because that's ultimately where we get all of our energy, right? And that is the amount that can come through the plants. Okay? Now, not all parts of the planet have equal ability to support life. There are some areas that are extremely rich. The tall grass prairies of the Central United States was an incredibly rich area to grow food on. And so the carrying capacity of the United States is really big. We have a tremendous potential to grow food. But an area like the Atacama Desert in Chile has a very low capacity for producing food because rainfall is limited, all those abiotic things. The abiotic resources are just not there. So that's a problem. There's a lower carrying capacity in that local area. So while this may be the global picture, we have to draw other diagrams which suggest what happens in the United States. Right? It's going to be, if this is just a same scale on this axis and this axis, the carrying capacity would be lower than the global, but then it would even be much lower in the Atacama Desert. That make sense? Because there's less resources to go around in the Atacama Desert. Each person has to have something to eat, so you can support more people on a really limited diet or very few people on a really, luxurious diet. Okay, that's true for anywhere in the world. You add all these places up. This is the desert. Desert of Chile, not the dessert Chile. The desert of Chile, you add that to the United States, you add that to the carrying capacity of Africa, and you add that to the carrying capacity of Vietnam, and you add that to the carrying capacity of Tasmania, and you'll end up adding up to the global carrying capacity. That makes sense, right? Okay. Here's the problem. We're not using all of our carrying capacity. We could, everybody in the United States could eat an even richer diet. We could consume 7,000 or 8,000 calories a day instead of our typical 2,000 to 3,000 calories a day, and we could all be huge. So we could support some really large people in the United States. Or we could support a really huge population of everyone eating a little bit of food, a 1,000-calorie diet or whatever. So you could do one or the other. The same thing is true in these other countries, but it's going to be on a different scale than it is in the United States because they can't produce as much food in total. Okay, here's the problem. We can take some of our carrying capacity and we can transport it to some other place. And by doing so, artificially raise their carrying capacity to a level that their local environment will not support. But because we're supplementing their carrying capacity, because we're giving them additional resources, we are really elevating their carrying capacity, but in an artificial way. Call it K prime versus K for Chile, the deserts of Chile. And when we've done that, we've made them dependent on us. Aren't we nice? We now have a captured audience. They have to do what we say. Because if they don't, we'll stop sending food. And their artificially raised carrying capacity is not going to be sustainable. They can't do it. Their environment will not permit that. So they either, learn how to mariculture oysters off the coast real quick and figure out how to feed people on sea urchins or something else, or there's going to be problems in that country. And we can dangle the carrot and say, well, if you come around, we'll give you the food back. So it doesn't necessarily happen that way now, but you could see it happening, right? You could see the power play working that way. But
and it should also be noted that we did not supply them with K prime out of the sheer love of humanity, out of the sheer bigness of our hearts. We did it because this was good for our farmers, and they made money, and our country prospered by doing that.
Definitely.
It also gives us more control as well.
Sure.
The Cold War ended, and we started shipping food to Russia almost immediately. Why?
For oil, you didn't mention the fact is, are we really at below our carrying capacity when the farms in Iowa can't grow the corn or the wheat?
Thank you. Perfect segue.
Well, yeah, but
This is the case.
without the oil that comes from Indonesia, where it's turned into fertilizer in Houston
Right.
and shipped by rail to Iowa.
It's estimated that for every 1 calorie we get from the food we produce, for every 1 calorie of food we produce, we have expended approximately 10 calories to get it. Well, where did that balance come from? I mean, we can't create energy out of thin air. The balance of the energy comes from fossil fuels. We supplement our diet with fossil fuels. And when the fossil fuels run out, whether we like it or not, there's going to be global starvation. There's not going to be any choice. Unless we make a massive shift to solar-powered trains to move fertilizer around the earth, it's going to happen. There's a finite amount of oil in the ground.
Fossil fuels is okay. Now, we've already established that in 1991.
Sorry, doing what? With
Killing.
Killing for fossil fuels.
Is consistent with
Okay.
American principles.
Well, maybe you are the evil Satan that Iraq.
But let's not say that it's only the United States that's doing this. Western Europe is doing the very same thing. Japan is doing the very same thing. We are all becoming interdependent on one another because we're shifting resources around so much that instead of lots of little carrying capacities, we're really looking at this one big global carrying capacity. And while this was the K global for humans plus life on Earth, this one, right? This is the relationship for humans if you want to keep the rest of life on Earth, because everything else on the Earth has to have something to live on too, right? So humans are not consuming all of the resources on the Earth because there's lots of other critters that are living on Earth. But as we humans begin to march towards the global carrying capacity of the planet, we are necessarily displacing, pushing to extinction, eliminating other species that are in competition with us for one thing: food. And if for some reason, and this is real, if for some reason the United States and some of the other big food-producing countries of the world suddenly don't produce as much food for a while because we suffer massive droughts, because we are suddenly subject to global climate change as a result of increased CO2 concentration of the atmosphere, heat, the climate changes locally, what happens when we can't produce quite as much food as we used to produce? We won't have all of what we had last time to send to all of these different countries that we've been supporting, not supporting out of the goodness of our heart, for crying out loud, they're paying us for it, but we won't have it to sell. We're going to have to keep it at home to feed our own populations, or our own pigs and chickens and cows because we want to eat meat, right? We're going to keep it at home. And if, we don't have enough to send over, then gee, it's been a really bad year. We've had lots of drought, where the crops failed. There was a big frost, and sorry, we don't have any food for you this time. Sorry.
So we're going to let those people starve,
yeah,
are we?
so oops. What do you mean your carrying capacity is too high because of us? Well, we didn't tell you to buy the food. We didn't tell you to make your populations grow. Why are you pointing the finger at us?
Family planning is indicating that we're not telling other countries. We only want you to have two, because I think we're saying very dramatically that that's not so.
Well, we're not, and that was the point is after the fact we might claim that, we never told you to increase your population sizes. We never told you to become dependent on us so much.
We just made it possible for you to have more food, have a better life.
Yeah.
We wanted you to have a better life.
We wanted you to have the same size population but have more food so everybody could live well. And you ended up converting it all to more people. Well, that's not our fault. So you're right. I mean, we may not be educating properly, and certainly we, withdrew all funding from family planning, and so getting at this third level of social organization that helps maintain the populations won't be possible unless we help it along at a faster rate. Or when it does eventually happen, it'll be far, far too late to do any good. So certainly you can't ignore, you can't give up on all these other things we're doing, but you must address this issue. You can't ignore this. Let's look at the United States as an example of this real quick, because you bring up an important point, that the carrying capacity of the United States really isn't. If we want to have caribou and bison and bald eagles and trout in the rivers, the carrying capacity of the United States is not really as high as it is right now. When we came into North America, the carrying capacity for humans in the United States early on, before we converted the tall grass prairies to agriculture, was actually much lower than it is right now. If we left the tall grass prairies alone and left the buffalo alone and left the caribou and we left all the songbirds alone, the United States would only be able to support a fraction of the population that it can now. The carrying capacity would be lower for humans because the carrying capacity for the rest of life is higher. And there's only so much carrying capacity in the United States in total, so you either have humans or everything else. You can't have both. So as you displace organisms by converting tall grass prairie into agriculture, you are bumping the carrying capacity for humans, right? KUS humans. You are bumping it up at the expense of the carrying capacity of all the rest of the animals and the plants in the United States. Their carrying capacity is going down. Animals are on the endangered and threatened list because their carrying capacity is being removed. Their habitats are being eliminated for the benefit of us. So we can grow more food, so we can have more subdivisions, so we can put a pool in, whatever it is. But the carrying capacity drops for them as it increases for us. And so perhaps the question is, where does the quality of life for us begin to drop as a result of eliminating the carrying capacity of everything else on the planet?
I have just been staggered by the difficulty that I've encountered, the resistance I've encountered from audiences to these ideas. People go bananas over these issues, which is why I will not take questions. Why I would not take questions the other night at the bigger Hope dialogue, because I knew we were going to do this, and I know how long it takes to go through all these issues. I think it's a miracle that we can do such a good job in even 4 hours.
We got lots more graphs to draw. This is only,
Yeah.
this is only one aspect of what we need to talk about.
It isn't, I don't think it's really that difficult, but it does take a little time. And, but you can't, I have seen that you can't work with, you stand in front of an audience and you know what their preconceptions are, what their pre-understandings are. And you can't immediately begin talking this way to them because they haven't the slightest idea of what you're talking about. And so they immediately want to ask me questions like, so Mr. Quinn, you would let the people of North Africa starve to death. And it's extremely difficult to try to explain to them why I say I do not let the winds blow, I don't let the drought happen, I don't let the typhoon blow, I don't let the tornadoes rage through us, and I don't let people starve to death. And so people become very upset with me. And I gave the speech that you find in the story of B on this subject, which I thought was pretty good. I thought it was, I didn't realize how ineffective it was. I gave this speech at St. Martin's College at an event that was basically centered around this speech. And in the middle of it, the representative of the zero population growth got up and walked out to show how he would not endorse what I was saying. He wanted to be sure everyone saw that I was wrong and that they were not going to go along with this. And a lot of people have invested in other concepts like the Union of Concerned Scientists. I don't know who these scientists are. They don't seem to be biologists, because they certainly are not thinking about it as this way, as a biologist does. And I think it's just the most important thing in the world right now to change people's minds about this. And you ask how we are to do that, and I think this is the step that I can take at this moment, and I'm just so delighted to have this forum, thanks to Wes Seeliger and the Foundation for Contemporary Theology, enabling me to make this video, which I hope to put in as many hands as we can, to make people realize that there is another point of view from the one that they're used to hearing, which is, oh, well, as soon as they solve all of their problems, all of their social problems, then population growth will go down and everything will be okay. And they don't know that there is another point of view on this. But how to go beyond this, must leave to others to suggestions.
It also occurs to me that if we look at this from the perspective of a resident of the United States, given that I believe a lot of this this world manipulation is being driven by corporate interests, part of that means that not only will we be reducing the K capacity for animals in this country, but I think we're beginning to do it for our own population. When we see companies that are downsizing and all the different things that are going on that are not really good for Americans, one of the reasons is this capacity is better placed from a corporate perspective, in international corporate perspective, into other nations to build up their desire for products. Everyone here has the CDs, the boom box, the fancy telephones, cars, whatever. Here are massive populations that if we can get them to increase even more, will all be potential blue jean buyers.
It's a good point.
And increase, this is going to really rub people the wrong way, and increase their standard of living.
Yes.
Yes.
We must increase their resource use per person, because that is our products going into their hands. And so we need to ship more resources to them.
And we need to ship more jobs to them.
Yeah.
So they can
And
buy
more
our
products and more food, because it's good for large companies.
I wanted to ask you a question, Dr. Thornhill. Do most evolutionary biologists, would they probably agree with you, or at least consider you, speaking for the general consensus, or would you be among your colleagues considered way out?
Let me put it this way. If I would have drawn all of these graphs and never written human up here, but had written white-tailed deer, or jackrabbits, or little blue stem grass, they would have all nodded, yep, sure enough, that's it. It's self-evident, it's obvious, yep, no problem. Humans, oh no, don't go there. No, we're different, no way. We're subject to every law that every other critter and plant is on the planet. And we have this layer of social stuff which modifies it, but it only modifies it after everything else has been working.
Do you oppose zero population ideas,
no.
or
No,
do you
no, not at
consider them allies, but you wish they would sort of wise up?
I think that we have to get out of the frame of mind of saying it's all going to be your fault, and that it's just your problem, your problem, your problem, your problem.
And if you would all just staple a condom on, everything would be fine.
That's what we have to get away from.
I mean, part of the mission of groups like Zero Population Growth and all is to put a condom in the hand of every human on the planet, and that will solve our problem. No. And what I think, and I won't speak for you here, but what I think is that you cannot stop those programs. You cannot stop doing what those people are doing, because yes, that's going to be necessary. Because even if we do manage to decrease the total amount of food produced, there is still going to be a time lag between when the food starts slowing down and when the population starts slowing down. Just like the snowshoe hare and the lynx, there's going to be a time lag, and that means trouble. So we have to have this third level of social stuff going on, or it's going to be much worse. It will be ameliorated if those social structures are in place or are moving towards being in place.
It's something we must do, but it's not going to be enough.
It's not enough.
Definitely not enough.